Despite killing nearly 40,000 Palestinians, Israel justifies its war on Gaza as self-defense. It describes critics, including the International Criminal Court, as anti-Semitic. So what's driving these narratives, and do they help sustain a continuous cycle of violence against the Palestinian people? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has described Israel's war on Gaza as an existential one for his country. Since October, Israeli forces have killed at least 40,000 people, most of them civilians. Hospitals, schools and shelters have been bombed repeatedly, with a huge loss of life. Warrants are being sought at the International Criminal Court for the arrest of Netanyahu and his defence minister on charges of crimes against humanity and war crimes in Gaza. Critics of the war, such as UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese and the International Court of Justice itself, have been accused by Israel of anti-Semitic bias. Throughout the war, as in the past, Israel's steadfast Western allies, notably the US, say their support remains ironclad and continue to supply arms, money and intelligence. So does Israel's narrative of self-defense help to sustain a cycle of violence seemingly without end? And while incidents of anti-Semitism in the West are indeed reported to be on the rise, does the frequent labelling of Israel's political opponents as anti-Semitic play a role in how Israel justifies its military action? We'll be discussing these issues with our guests shortly, but first, this report from Imogen Kimber.
The war on Gaza has killed nearly 40,000 civilians in 10 months and flattened large areas of the Strip. Israel's government says it's self-defense.
Israel's commitment to international law is unwavering. Equally unwavering is our sacred commitment to continue to defend our country and defend our people. Like every country, Israel has an inherent right to defend itself.
And despite Netanyahu's government being accused of war crimes and collective punishment, its powerful allies agree.
Our commitment to Israel's security is ironclad. We will continue to defend Israel against attacks from terrorist groups or their sponsors.
We have made it clear from the outset that we are bound by international law. This implies the right of every state to self-defense. This means that Israel has the right to defend itself against these terrorist attacks, just like any other country in the world.
Yet these countries also say, under international law, Israel should ensure the safety of civilians. Israel consistently describes those who attack the country and those who criticise its military actions as being anti-Semitic. Authorities and civil groups around the world say there has been a rise in anti-Semitic attacks during the war on Gaza.
We have seen, since October 7 last year, a significant rise in anti-Semitism in Australia. And that is why the government has made the decision to appoint a special envoy on anti-Semitism.
In Europe, accusations of anti-Semitism have a powerful impact because of some states' long history of anti-Semitism, including the Holocaust. But some say allegations are being used as a political weapon.
We have to respect the work of the International Criminal Court. The prosecutor in the court has been strongly intimidated and accused of anti-Semitism. As always, that everyone does something that Netanyahu government doesn't like.
The International Criminal Court has applied for arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defence Minister Yoav Gallant for alleged war crimes in Gaza that include the bombing of civilians and collective punishment, including deliberate starvation. And in the International Court of Justice, Israel has been accused of genocide and is widely acknowledged to have been breaking international law for decades during its occupation of Palestine. Critics say Israel justifies its military action as self-defense, with the support of its Western allies, as part of a cycle that's continued for decades, as has the suffering of the people it attacks. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. In New York is Rabbi Yisroel Dovid Weiss, an activist and spokesman of Neturei Karta, that's a religious sect of Haredi Jews. In Bristol in the UK, David Miller, a former professor of political sociology at Bristol University, whose dismissal after unfounded anti-Semitic allegations was ruled unlawful. And in Toronto, Muhannad Ayyash is a professor at Mount Royal University and a policy analyst for the Palestinian Policy Network. A very warm welcome to all of you. Muhannad, I'll start with you in Toronto. How has Israel so successfully distorted the meaning, the idea of anti-Semitism, and used that distortion to further its policies?
Yeah, absolutely. Israel is at war with reality. The reality of what the Israeli state project is doing to the Palestinian people is a brutal reality, one of genocide, expulsion, displacement, and the outright denial of the Palestinian people to their right to live on their lands as free and sovereign people. And to conceal that reality, the Israeli state has used a couple of tropes. One of them is this notion of the quote-unquote new anti-Semitism that more or less equates all serious critiques of Israel and Zionism with anti-Semitism. Now, let's be very clear. Anti-Semitism is a serious problem. It's real. European anti-Semitism is foundational to the rise of the European state. But this weaponization of anti-Semitism has been done strategically to conceal the crimes of the Israeli state and allow it to continue its genocide of the Palestinian people. This is why it is critical to name the weaponization of anti-Semitism by that label, to call it a weaponization, to oppose it, because the Palestinian people are the first people to pay the price for this weaponization of anti-Semitism. But it will also hurt Jewish communities in the UK, in Canada, in the US, in France, in the long run. It already is doing it right now.
Yeah,
when
I know.
Weaponize
Muhannad, I know you've spoken a lot. Yeah, I know you've spoken a lot about how it hurts, not just about how throwing the term anti-Semitism around hurts not just the Palestinian people, but also Jewish people in the long run. I want to bring in Rabbi Weiss in New York. Rabbi, I see that you're wearing a badge that says a Jew, not a Zionist. For people who might not know, can you explain to us the very real difference between Zionism and the religion Judaism?
Yeah, so with the help of the Almighty, I pray that He should bestow upon me His truth, His wisdom, that I may be worthy of conveying His message and so sanctify His name and bring peace to the world. Amen. Judaism is a religion of 3,000 years that the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we made a covenant with God on Mount Sinai. Moses brought us the Torah, where we are to be subservient to God and uphold the laws of the Torah. That is all what Judaism is. Now, it's 3,000 years later, a movement started, a mere 100-odd years ago, a movement called Zionism that is a purely nationalist political movement that is simply masquerading in the religion. They want to have a land grab. They want to have their sovereignty, and they ignore totally what Judaism is, first of all, that it's to be serving God and not the nationalist endeavor. And secondly, they're ignoring totally that we were sent into exile 2,000 years ago, because when we were taken into the Holy Land, when Moses took the Torah, we were required to go in. It was under stipulation by the Almighty that we have to be on a very high level of spirituality. If not, we will be expelled from the land as a nation. As individuals, we can live there under the auspices, under the rules of the different rules like Ottoman Empire and so forth. But as a nation, we are to cease to exist as a nationalism, as a country, as a sovereignty, as a kingdom. And this was obeyed. 2,000 years ago, we were spread out amongst the nations of the world, and we are under oath by God that we should not re-establish any Jewish sovereignty in any part of the world, even in an uninhabited land, and certainly not by killing or stealing. And there's a special oath that we are not permitted to return en masse as a large number to the Holy Land. So Zionism, when these people who are not religious, basically, so many of them were refuted God, and many of them just simply were not religious. Theodor Herzl, Chaim Weizmann, Ben Gurion. I have the picture when they made the Declaration of Independence. Ben Gurion reading it in Independence Hall, 1948. Like none of them you see are basically almost none certainly aren't even covering their heads like a Jew should. And they're calling it a Jewish state. They have the Stars of David on the wall. And so basically they're making a state that is supposed to be a Jewish, that God gives us the land. And on truth, all the rabbis said, what you're doing, you're not allowed to kill, you're not allowed to steal, and certainly not to a people that was so kind to us, that embraced us when we suffered so much anti-Semitism throughout the hundreds of years in Europe. How dare you vilify these people and declare that they're against your occupation because they're anti-Semitic? So in every facet, the core belief that Judaism is nationalism, to take a piece of land, is in antithetical.
Okay, so
to
you're
Judaism.
Actually saying that what the state of Israel, what you're saying is that what the state of Israel, what the government of Israel is doing right now is actually antithesis to Judaism. Mr. Miller, let me bring you in. You were sacked from your job at the University of Bristol, falsely accused of being anti-Semitic because you spoke against Zionism. The Bristol Employment Tribunal ruled that was completely unlawful, and that there is a place to criticize Zionism in the United Kingdom. Israel would not be able to carry out these policies and promote Zionism without support, as we've been talking, as we mentioned, from the UK, the US and other Western allies. Can you tell us about how it has been so successful, how Western allies have promoted Zionism so successfully?
So in my case, what happened was the court decided that I had not been sacked for raising criticisms of the attack on me by certain Zionist groups, but I had been sacked in fact because I had anti-Zionist views. And the anti-Zionist views should be protected under law as worthy of respect in a democratic society. They were not racist and ought to be protected under the Equality Act of 2010. Now, that, of course, is entirely different to the view which is given by the Israeli government and the Zionist movement, which is that there is no difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And they have been trying to foster this idea for more than 50 years. In particular, they were able to get it codified into the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition in 2016. And that has been the weapon they have used ever since against all of the movements for a free Palestine. Now, the problem, of course, is that since the launch of the genocide in October last year, everybody can see that what's happening is a genocide. Everyone who has any access to media information or alternative information knows there's a genocide. And it means that whenever the Israelis try and say, oh, but you're just being anti-Semitic, that charge has less force. And more people are now saying, no, this is not anti-Semitism. This is a criticism of the racism and the genocidal nature of Zionism as an ideology, not just of the particular Israeli government, but of the Jewish state in itself.
Muhannad, David says that charge of anti-Semitism has less force, but at the same time, he mentioned the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, which has been adopted by not just the UK in 2016, the UK government, but we have seen the US House of Representatives try to codify that definition. So does the charge of anti-Semitism have less force when governments in the West are codifying that definition, which very much equates being critical of Israel as being anti-Semitic?
Absolutely. So this is part of the Israeli state strategy. This is not just some, grassroots effort of scholars and activists and community members coming together and coming up with this definition that focuses almost exclusively on criticism of Israel as the definition of anti-Semitism. This is driven by the Israeli state, funded by the Israeli state, supported by the Israeli state, which has sought since at least the 1970s to spread this idea of the quote unquote, like I said, new anti-Semitism.
But Muhannad, why are Western countries like, sorry to interrupt,
right.
but I just want to know why Western countries, like the US, like the UK, like Germany, why they're so quick to go with that?
And for that answer, you have to go back a little bit in history, and I'll be as brief as possible. Zionism is a political ideology, and one that does not actually oppose European colonialism and racism, or even European anti-Semitism, because it says the solution to the Jewish question in Europe is to leave Europe and build a European-like state in the land of the backward Orient. The Arabs, the Palestinians. And of course, for that to work, they had to expel the Palestinians from the land. The land was already inhabited. The Palestinians had lived on it for thousands of years. So they had to expel the Palestinians from their land. Now, the European empires saw this as an opportunity, especially the British Empire at first and now the American Empire. They saw this as an opportunity to deal with two problems. Because of their anti-Semitism, they didn't want Eastern and Central European Jews fleeing pogroms and violence in Eastern and Central Europe coming into Western Europe. And they wanted imperial interests to be addressed in the region. So they thought actually moving European Jews to build a European-style state, they will be dependent on their existence on us, which means that they'll be loyal to us and our interests. So when Israel uses this weaponization of anti-Semitism, it still plays those two roles for the European states and the United States. It helps them atone, quote unquote, for their guilt of the Holocaust and European anti-Semitism, and it secures Israeli settler colonialism, and therefore it secures their own imperial interests in the region. Now, I just want to emphasize,
I want to bring Rabbi Weiss in there on the points that you're making, because you're saying that, it secures their settlement project is one of the things that it does. But Rabbi Weiss, does it secure Jews all over the world? Jewish Voice for Peace was very critical of the US House of Representatives adopting these resolutions. They said that falsely stating anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism conflates all Jews with the Israeli state and endangers our communities. Does Jewish Voice for Peace have a point? Do the efforts to tie Jewish people to the state of Israel so intrinsically actually make them a target because of the crimes that the state is committing?
Yes, so with the help of the Almighty, there's so much issues that you touched on. First of all, I would like to mention that my grandparents were killed in Auschwitz. My father escaped from the Nazis, and the majority of my family, from both my father and mother's side of blessed memory, were killed by the Nazis in Poland and in Hungary. And so we know the suffering of the Holocaust, but there's two issues. The charge of anti-Semitism, when you use it falsely, is you're taking a charge when people are blatantly committing a genocide, a crime, murdering, torturing, and then you scream anti-Semitism. What you've just done is not only my grandparents, you're taking the ashes of my grandparents and you're going to burn them again. You're taking the charge of anti-Semitism and you're making it worthless, because you're using it. People say, oh, that's what anti-Semitism means when somebody does a crime, and so it makes it. And secondly, it exacerbates anti-Semitism thousandfold. There are people, many people, Muslim people amongst us, certainly, as we know our history, we were embraced in the Muslim countries when we were suffering anti-Semitism. And in Europe, many people felt the suffering of Jews. They sympathize, they want to help the Jews. And all of a sudden, they start questioning because they don't understand to differentiate between Jews who are in support of the state of Israel and Zionism, and the ones who are true to the religion, who we are all in total opposition, and we cry and feel the suffering of the people of Gaza. We demonstrate in the streets of Jerusalem. You know what happens? We don't have guns, we don't have knives. Jews don't do that ever. For 76 years, they get brutally beaten by the Israeli police. They get arrested. They murdered. They get assassinated. Our rabbis, children, old people.
Doctor.
This is ongoing, and this is something that you can see. And so let me just explain that. They use, as was mentioned, they use the Holocaust guilt of the world, and they harp on that, and they use memories, Yad Vashem, all these things of the Holocaust in order, as a gun, as a tool, as a weapon to have people to silence the people who want to speak up for what they look as criminal. But ironically, the very Jewish people around the world, the more the religious they are, and that you will see invariably, whether it is in New York, we have the second largest Jewish community right across from Manhattan, Williamsburg, Brooklyn. There's not one Israeli flag. In Stamford Hills in London, in Jerusalem, in Mea Shearim, where we have hundreds of thousands of Jews. They are true to the Torah and they refuse to accept this false Judaism, this pure, base, selfish, flawed nationalism. Just let me mention here, the chief rabbi of Palestine in 1947, who was the head of the Jewish community that was living prior to the Zionists coming from Europe. And he pleaded with the United Nations. He said, we furthermore wish to express our definite opposition to a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. This was not an anti-Semite. He was the head of this large Jewish community that's living in Palestine.
And yet, despite that, Rabbi Weiss, there are so many people in the Jewish community who are right now being accused of being anti-Semitic because they're anti-Zionist. I'm glad you told us about, how many family members you lost in the Holocaust because you yourself are accused of being a Holocaust denier because you don't support the Zionist project. David, if I can bring you in now on one of the, many points that Rabbi Weiss was making, and, he mentioned the Nazi Holocaust. How problematic is Germany's position? Because it is one of the places in the West where we see anti-Zionism being conflated so strenuously with anti-Semitism. How problematic is that position for Germany to take that position because of its, responsibility for the Nazi Holocaust, to say that we're going to stand by a state that is carrying out a genocide against a people?
Well, I think what you have to understand here is that this conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism has real consequences in terms of reporting of the extent of anti-Semitism in society. So I see on your screen, we have repeatedly the claim that anti-Semitism has risen markedly since October the 7th. Well, it's claimed that that's the case in the UK. The official government figures suggest that anti-Semitism rose 1,300% after October the 7th. But this is entirely a fabrication because, of course, what's being done is that they're using the IHRA to define a pro-Palestinian speech as being anti-Jewish hate crime. So people are being arrested for shouting Free Palestine or From the River to the Sea. 2 people were arrested for hate crimes for carrying effigies of bloodied babies on marches. So this is an entirely fictitious rise in anti-Semitism. There is a rise in racism in the society against Muslims, against Arabs, against Palestinians, not against Jews. This is entirely fictitious. Now, of course, what we see with Germany is Germany supporting the genocide, just like the UK and just like the US. But it's not just to do with Holocaust guilt. It's to do, rather, I think, with the question of the penetration of Zionist assumptions into the very fabric of political society. In Germany, yes. In France, too. In the UK. So that, for example, you mentioned the British government has adopted the IHRA. All the political parties in the UK have adopted the IHRA who are in Parliament. The police forces have adopted the IHRA. All of these institutions are effectively in the grip of the Zionist movement by Zionist penetration. That's why we see the ability of our societies, which should have an adherence to international law, to questions of objections to ethnic cleansing, coming down on the side of the Zionist understanding of these things, which is that anybody who says Free Palestine, who supports the liberation of Palestine, is by definition an anti-Semite. This is a fake definition of anti-Semitism, and so therefore we don't see any rise, really, any observable rise in anti-Semitism in the last 6 to 10 months. What we do see is a rise of people being arrested and charged for crimes which are not crimes, which are pro-Palestinian chants.
Muhannad, do you agree with that? And when David talks about, all of these governments and institutions within the governments being in the grip of this essentially propaganda by Israel around Zionism, how can we actually find a solution to what's happening in Israel and Palestine beyond a ceasefire when this is the pervasive narrative that criticizing Israel in any way, that advocating for Palestinian self-determination is anti-Semitic?
Absolutely. So, and we need to be again opposing this weaponization of anti-Semitism, this so-called new anti-Semitism. So, one thing that we need to do is, oppose institutions within our societies, whether it's Canada, the U.S., the U.K., Germany, France, oppose institutions that have adopted the IHRA. Tell them that they are violating academic freedom, freedom of speech, and that they're also participating in the genocide of the Palestinian people. I think what we're seeing right now is that institutions are still responding to this weaponization of anti-Semitism and accepting it. But people on the ground are increasingly not. People on the ground see the Israeli government calling the International Court of Justice anti-Semitic, and then they look at the hearing and they're like, well, that was perfectly reasonable and valid criticisms and presentation of facts and evidence. This is not anti-Semitism. So the more that the Israeli state and Western states and the institutions within Western states continue to participate in the weaponization of anti-Semitism, they are actually participating in their own delegitimization in the eyes of people. So I think, while this is serving Israeli interests in the short term, in the long term, we're going to see more distrust of institutions that follow this path.
Yeah, which are already at such a high... Muhannad, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we only have a couple of minutes left in the program. And Rabbi Weiss, I do want to come to you. We only have a couple of minutes left, and I would like to ask you a question. I know you haven't been to Israel in decades because you don't want to give any legitimacy to the state. Do you hope that in your lifetime you will go back to Israel because of a change in how it treats the Palestinians?
Well, I will say it in Arabic, inshallah, I hope to return to a free Palestine, not to an Israel. And in the Torah, it warns us that if you are rebelling against God, against the Almighty, it will not be successful. We are sure, our rabbis preach this, and my not going to Israel was the chief rabbi of Palestine himself moved away, Rabbi Teitelbaum, moved to New York and held court from New York for many years, and he kept on urging people to leave. Let me say that we plead, it's an insult to common sense, to common logic, to constantly ignore the massive difference between the sun and the moon, the difference between Judaism and Zionism. And they keep on for 76 years murdering people, and also including Jewish people amongst them.
Rabbi Weiss, just quickly, because you're saying, murdering people, how do these narratives promote the continuation, the perpetuation of the violence against Palestinians?
Oh, because they've been given a free ride, even through the media. And there is no somebody looking over the shoulder. They saw that they're able to commit one crime 76 years already, more and more for 76 years, more settlements and more settlements. The common sense of every human being sees Judaism is to serve God, and to occupy and kill and steal is not serving God, and it's not Judaism. It's contradictory to Judaism. There is no right for it. But the politicians see that if they speak up against this, they're committing political suicide, and this is the way they get their votes. So we're pleading with the political leaders, you have to answer to God one day and to your grandchildren. How could you be silent when you're going to wake up one day, just like apartheid? People realized eventually that it's simply criminal, racist, and to name nobody will take up. We're just saying that this should stop immediately. This is a crime against God, and it's not Judaism. It's just the opposite of Judaism. We are crying and hurting a free Palestine, and give us back our Judaism, and it will be. And the anti-Semitism is the state of Israel. Zionism is the personification of anti-Semitism. They are causing death and suffering of Palestinians. They're killing them and causing, that should be, God forbid, death to the Jewish people. God forbid, because of what the accusation. People look at us like criminals. Besides everything else that they're causing unrest.
Rabbi Weiss, thank you so much. That is Rabbi Yisroel Dovid Weiss in New York, David Miller in Bristol, and Muhannad Ayyash in Toronto. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.